Hi folks, we're going to continue the same series. This time we're going to look into the model classes. So we had a very simple introduction of the club, and we sort of put in very simple ideas about three main entities. One is going to be the facility, the other one is going to be the member who uses the facility, and of course the booking records, right? So this is basically the three entity classes we want to work with. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to create such kind of entity classes and what would you try to do in order to make them persistent. Okay? So we'll keep the class modeling simple because of course we are not interested in having a very sophisticated model. The idea is to see how the simple wireframes can be executed. So I'm going to create a class. Of course, I'm going to create it in the package. I'm going to call this as domain models. So I'm going to call this as domain entity. I'm going to call the class as facility. So this is the first class I'm interested in creating. And what are the key attributes that I would wish to have in this particular facility? One thing is I want to treat this as a data class. So I'm going to say use data and make it into a data class. And I'm also going to say there is a no argument constructor that is here for this particular facility model. Now I can have a simple private wrapper class which is integer, and I call this as facility ID. And then of course I can have another private attribute which is string, and then of course facility name. So I'm going to call this as facility name. Yes, this is the second one. And of course I can have a description in case somebody is interested in seeing what the facility is trying to look at. Yes, this is basically the three fields that I need. Of course, beyond the no argument constructor, I'm also free to create any kind of constructor. So I can look in for source, create constructor using fields, one constructor using all fields, and one constructor just using the name and description, because I can allow the ID to be generated by the database, which eventually I will do. So I'm going to create another constructor without the ID, but by just passing the name and the description. So these are the key IDs that I need, and of course the getter setters are all created already. So this is the model class. Okay, so it is time that I do the similar model class for member as well. So there is going to be member ID, member name. Of course, now I can give him a username and password as well. Okay, so first name, last name, username, password. And of course, is there any other details I remember about member also can be created. So I'm going to create another new class. I'm going to call this class as member. So in this member class, I'm also going to say this is a data class, which means it has got getters and setters and no argument constructor as well. So these are the things that I need. So it's all set. Now what are the fields I would put in? I will definitely put in a wrapper integer class. This is going to be member ID, primary key. Then of course I'm going to have a private string first name. And then of course I can also have a private string last name. Yeah. I can have private string username, and of course I can have private string password. So these are the details that I would like to remember regarding this member. Okay. So this is all done. Of course, as always, I would like to have additional constructors. I go to this source. I'm going to create constructor using field, one for all fields, and one excluding the ID, so that I can allow the database to generate the ID. Okay. So except member ID, everything else can be passed in for the constructor. So this is how I create a member record. So this is also done. Okay. So these are the main things. I think this is done. Then what I can do is I can create an enum, which is basically booking status. I can say it's booked or it is cancelled. Okay. So what I can do is I can create a enum class. I'm going to call this as enumerated class. I'm going to call this as booking status. Okay. So what can be the status of booking at any point on time? Let's see. how do I want to put this? This is the enum class, right? So I'm going to have two states here, booked and cancelled. So in case the record or the booking is deleted, then of course I want to cancel the booking status. Okay? So this is essentially what I want to remember regarding the booking. So any other details is very clear. I need a member, I need a facility, I need a booking ID, I need a from date and a to date. Okay? And of course, is there any other comments while I do the booking? I would like to have the comments as well. This is for arranging the facility. So I'm going to create another class, and this time I'm going to call this as booking. Okay? And I'm going to use the regular getter setter. So I'm going to declare this as a data class so that I don't have to write separate getter setters. Then I'm going to call this a no argument constructor as well, so I don't have to construct a no argument constructor. So it helps me to focus on the private integer, same star, booking ID. Okay. So this is the primary key of the record which is getting created here, and some valid member is going to book the facility. So I'm going to say which member has booked it. So I remember the member details. I'm going to say this is a valid facility. Okay. So I'm going to use the facility and that is also to be remembered. Okay. And of course you know that I remember the booking status. Okay. I'm going to say there is this booking status that is remembered as status. Okay. So I put that as the status that is to be remembered. So I can also now look into the date range. So I can say private date. Okay. So I can use either I can use the util date or I can use the SQL date. Util date is the most standard one. Okay, so I'm going to say from date. So this is the starting date, and of course it's going to be booked from to date. Okay, so initially I'll start looking at just date range, and then of course we can increase that to slot if necessary. Okay, so this is the date range. Okay, so you can book the facility for 1 day, 2 days, how many ever days that you want. And of course, when you're doing the booking, you're going to have any special instructions. I'm going to capture that at private string comments. Okay? So I'm going to capture all those details as well. So you know that there is a no argument constructor already done. So additionally, I'm going to have constructors which is using all the fields as usual. And of course, another constructor which uses everything except for the primary key. So I remove the primary key ID and then pass the rest. Okay. So that's it, all the three classes are created for me. So this is how the basic modeling is done. Of course, if you don't have this Lombok facility, these classes won't come here. So then what you do is you have to go here and write getters and setters. You got to say right click, source, create getters and setters. And you have to create getter setters for all of them. So this will generate a lot of getter setter methods. And you also have to give a no argument constructor. So you can simply say source and get constructor using superclass. So that's an empty argument constructor created for you. And then you can actually write a two string and all that. Okay? So I don't want all these methods. I want my classes to be clean. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use Lambo. And if I want a toString method, I will simply say use a toString method. So this will also create a toString for me to just print the class. Okay. So what I'll do is, for consistency's sake, I'll use this toString in all the model classes. So anytime I wish to sort of print the data, I can get it from the toString. So this is all you need, and I've basically created it using the Lombok. If you don't have Lombok working or you have issues running the Lombok, then you have to write your getter setters, empty argument constructors, and toString. So this utility is trying to save you a few lines of code. So that is pretty much the basic entity modeling that is necessary. So now we need to write code for persistence. So how do we go about doing it? We need a repository layer, and this repository layer is going to have some JPA repository classes. So this is exactly what we discussed on the previous repository discussion. So I'm just taking that as a basis. And if you do not understand what the repository classes are, my suggestion is open a browser, so you should be able to go into Spring IO. So you can see that this is the main documentation that you are dealing with, and then you are interested in learning the Spring framework. So when you select that, you have many API help that comes from here. So you're going to look at data access. So when you select the data access facility, it gets you into the data access documentation. Data access is used for many things, and what we are going to look at is basically JPA. Okay. So you can see that you can come into a very simple way of doing JPA inclusion. And of course, you can see that the whole documentation talks about many things, transaction management, this, that. What we are very interested on just the ORM access, which is the Java related access. So I'm going to take ORM, and in that I'm going to be interested on JPA. So I just take the 5th chapter, 5.4. So this talks about how ORM for JPA is being set. One thing is I've basically used the libraries that is needed in the POM file, so you don't need any additional setup. So in case you are working with lower versions of Spring framework, then you got to initialize beans that will start including JPA in it. For us, we just used the POM file to include the JPA, so all the basic setting up is done. Now what is interesting about JPA is how we could use JPA into transactions. So you can simply implement a DAO that is based on JPA quite easily. If you want, you can implement a full-fledged collection, or if you want, you can simply use the repository classes. Okay, so that makes it easier for you to write JPA related transactions. And writing the transactions basically means that you need a repository class that comes by default. So you can create a very simple repository class that helps you to do the mapping. Okay? So that's exactly what we are going to look at. So let's see how to do that. Okay? So when you go back to the Spring framework, when you go back to the Spring framework, when you go back to the JPA, you're having different setup for JPA. So you've got to look at for JPA access. So let me say where is JPA is under data access. So there's too many things. So let me just look for the documentation from this document Spring IO. I go back to the document Spring IO, which gives me the entire document support. So I'm going to look for projects again, Spring framework. Okay. So here I can look for a particular feature, which is the JPA. And I can look for Spring Data JPA. Okay. So this is what I'm going to use for my project. So if you go into the Learn, you have the documentation. I'm going to take the generally available release and API document. So this is the Spring Data setup that we are going to use. We have already included the Spring Data, so it allows us to create any kind of data persistence project. So we have already included the Maven file to point to Spring Data. So that basically gets the installation solved. So I'm moving on to the Spring Data repositories. So when you talk about repositories, there are many repositories. One is going to be the CRUD repository interface, which is the basic. Paging and sorting is the next level repository. The very useful repository that we will be using is basically JPA repository. Fortunately, that's not directly given here, so maybe I have to look for it. So core concepts, CRUD repository, paging and sorting repository, and of course the third repository is JPA repository. And of course you can see that you can start creating your own repository that you need as well. Okay, so let me show you. So I'm going to create an interface that says whatever repository extends JPA repository and the user class, and of course the primary key that I'm going to deal with. So this is how I sort of define repositories. So I can say my repository extends JPA repository, or I can even do the same with CRUD repository and pagination. Okay. So I want to use JPA repository, so I'm just going to see how the basic configuration class looks like. So I go back to the workspace. So I first create a package, and I'm going to call this as .repo. So this will have all my repository related classes and interfaces. The next job is to create an interface. I'm going to say new interface. This interface is for facility, so I'm going to call this as facility repo, and this is going to extend the interface called JPA repository. So I select the one from the framework, I say finish, so it gives me an empty template. So you know this is your user defined class. In this case it's the facility, and ID is basically the primary key. In this case it's going to be the integer wrapper class. Okay, so when I import the right classes, this interface is fully done. So is there any errors? No. So when I save this file, the error is gone. So this is a very simple repository class for facility. I can have an additional repository class for member, and I can do the same for booking as well. So I'm going to create another interface. I'm going to call this as member repo. Okay, so this is again going to take the same JPA class, and of course when I finish it, the template is going to be the member class. So I'm going to say member from the booking domain, and this is going to be practically the integer wrapper class. So I'm going to pick the Java language interface, which is interface. So this is also done. I need one more repository class, interface. In this case it's the booking repository. I'm going to call this as booking repo. Again going to inherit the JPA repository, and the user class is called as booking from the domain. So I'm going to say booking from the domain class, and the primary key is going to be integer. So I'm going to say integer from the Java language. So the repository class is also created. So what we have done in the last 15 minutes is we have created domain classes. For every domain class we have created the repository classes. Okay? So this is good enough for us for starters, and let's see if we can write any special queries as necessary. So there may be additional queries that I want on the member repository. For instance, I may want to find the member by first name. Okay? I may want to find the member by last name. I may want to find the members by username. Okay? So I can do many things on the member, for instance, additional. So I can write additional queries for it. So for instance, I will try to show you some examples here, because member has got plenty of additional classes. Okay? So one way is to just write a query. So I'm going to say list of member is going to be the return type. So it's going to give me the list is wrong, it's not empty, so I should remove this. It's util list. Okay, so I'm going to use the array list. So I'm going to say, maybe I can even say array. So list is fine because it's an interface list. So when I say list, it should come from Java util. Okay? And the member is basically the booking domain. I'm going to call this as find members by first name, and I'm going to pass in a parameter. So I'm going to call this as parameter. Okay, so this is the parameter that I'm going to use, which is from the JPA query repository, and I'm going to call this as first name. So that's going to be the variable, and this is going to be mapped into string first name. Okay. Or I can even call the parameter slightly differently. F name is the argument, and this is mapped. Okay. So this is the query signature that I want to create. Okay. So I think that should be fine. It is complaining because I started the F name, I did not finish it properly, and yeah, so I started the query, I started everything, but param is not recognized, so this is going to be from the repository. Okay, so that solves the problem. Now I need to write a query, right? So this query is basically object-oriented query. So I'm going to say query. I'm going to put in my query instance. It's going to be like this: select. Okay. I'm going to call this as m from member. I'm going to call the member a small m, where I can say m dot first name is like colon f name, the argument that I'm passing. Okay. So this is my query. Of course my query comes from the repository, so I've got to make sure I select the query from the repository. So this is one query. I can do the same for last name, so I can create another query, and this time it's going to be last name. Maybe I can call the variable as lname, and this is going to be lname as well, so I'm going to call this as last name. and I can't use the same member. I'm going to call this as last name as well. So this is again another query. Okay. Again, I can have the same set, but this time I'm going to use the username. So I'm just going to say username, okay, like uname. I'll call the variable as uname, okay, and that's going to be the argument here, and I'm going to use the username. So all these variables come from my member class. First capital N name, username is all small, password is all small. So I'm going to use the very similar one. First capital N, last capital N. Here username is the same as, okay. So here also I'm going to be in sync with username, okay. And I've created one for my username. So I cannot search by password, it's not necessary. So this should be sufficient for me to find a particular member. Okay. So I've written some additional queries beyond the basic queries. Okay. So let me save this. Now on the facility, what can I do? I can do a few other things on the facility. For example, I can try to create a facility. I can look for facilities that's being booked by a particular called by a particular name. Okay, so I can list all the facilities by name. I can look for, I think that's the only thing that I can do, because if you look at the facility class, there are only two things. One is the facility ID, the other is the facility name. So what I can do is I can write a query that can find similar facilities, and then I can probably select that and use it in my, yes, beyond all the finding all the facility. That's what I would like to do. So in the facility repository, what I can do is I can create a list. This list comes from Java Util, and the list is going to be from the facility of the domain class. I can say find facilities by name. Okay. So I can, as usual, have a parameter, which is the query aggregator. Okay, I can give in a name. I'm going to call this just name, and then this is going to be string. This is going to be string name. Okay, so it's going to be mapped against this, and the signature ends here. So I got to write a query injection for it. I'm going to say query, and then I'm going to put the query in double quotes. This query is again from the framework query.jpa repository query. So here I'm going to say select f from facility, alias name is f, where f dot name is like colon name, whatever is the variable name I'm doing here. Okay. So as long as they are similar, it's going to pull out the facility names for me. So this is the only facility query that I write. There are many booking queries I may have to write. Okay, so of course, I think I will leave the booking queries to a little later. I can say find booking for a particular date. I can find booking for a particular facility ID, and just to see whether the booking is available for that particular day. And if it is available for the whole date range, I can go ahead and book. So I can write a query for that. So I'll come to this a little later. These are the basic simple queries. I've not gone into the complicated booking queries where there is association mapping and all. So this is very simple set of queries. Okay. So we have done all this repository class, and of course the main part here is to set up the resource, which basically means I have to configure some details that tells me that it basically connects to databases. Okay. Of course, I can connect to MySQL database or Microsoft SQL database or anything. In this case, I'm just going to connect to H2 database. So I'll try to keep my connectivity details quite simple. Okay. And this is basically to tell you that it's possible for you to persist very strong data sets at a later stage. Okay. So here I'm just going to use the H2 database. I'm going to enable the console. I'm going to show you some dialects and all that. Right. So for that, what I will do is I'll go into the application.repository file, and then of course I have certain kind of default settings that I need to put in. So let me go back. So these are the details that I will put in. So I'll say the driver is H2. The URL is, I have to give a name to the database. I'm going to call this as booking, because we call the Username is essay and password is nothing. I'm going to enable the console. I'm going to trace it. So I'm also trying to show that the H2 database is on. The dialect is H2 dialect. And of course, I'm going to modify the table every time I create it. So I put in all the database connection details. So I have domain classes, I have repository classes that tells you how to connect to the database, and these are the configuration details to the database. So I think this is pretty much done. Let's see if everything works without any error. So I'm going to right click and then say run as Spring Boot application. So I'm going to select Spring Boot app and see what happens inside my console. Okay. So if I have any connectivity issues or if I have any configuration issues, this application won't start as expected. So you can see that there is something that is going wrong. Okay. So it starts. There is a trouble when enable invocation fails. So it says the booking class and the other class are not actually managed, which is true, right? So when I put in the booking class, I didn't make it as an entity class, or I didn't make it as a persistent class. So that part is a bit tricky. So that's why it's saying, okay, there are some classes, there is some database set up, but when it comes to starting the bean, particularly when it is trying to create the bean called booking repository, it has got difficulty creating a bean as booking because the booking class is not created as an entity item. So let's solve that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down the server. So it is not working. So that's fine. I'll just clear my service here. My job is to come back and create all these things as entity classes. How do I do that? I'll start with the facility, the simplest one. I'm going to change this into an entity class. So an entity class is persisted. I pick the Java JPA persistence to create this, and of course I got to create this as an ID identifier, so I create this as an identifier as well. So that should help me solve the basic persistence problem, but that's not all, right? I may still need to have some details on how the key is generated, how it is going to be persisted, and so on and so forth. So for that I need to put in the generated value type, and of course there are many ways to do that. You can generate it as a very simple persistent class where database controls identifier, or you can allocate the persistence model to the application to take care of the domain as well. Both facilities are, both way of persistence is fine, but for simplicity I'll start with auto persistence. Okay. So I'm going to say generated value. So this is going to be generated every time there's a record that gets created. It is going to have a generated value, and this generated value is going to be created by a strategy, and the strategy is going to be by generation type, and I'm going to do the type as auto. So automatically ID gets created. That's the idea. Then of course I got to do the same thing for other two domain classes as well. So member is also an entity class, okay? And member also has got identifier and auto generator. The same thing with booking. Booking is also an entity class. So I pick this from the persistence layer, and booking primary key is also generated. Okay. So is this enough for the facility? No, because for the booking is a bit complicated, because booking also has member and facility. Okay. So member as well as facility needs to be mapped. The simplest way is to just do a one directional mapping. So every single member is from the member table on a one-to-one relationship. Every facility is from the facility table on a one-to-one relationship. This is single directional relationship. And what I can do is I can also fix dates. Okay, so I can say the from date and to date is of date and time format pattern. So I can say date time format, and I can say what's the pattern. Okay, so I can say pattern is equal to, and I can put in any pattern I want. So I can say y, the year first, and then of course month, and then followed by day. So this is the format I want for the today, from date, as well as the today until when the facility is being booked. And I can also insist that the from day and end date, which is the from date to date, must be today date or any futuristic date. So I can say future or present. So either today or future. The same holds good for this end date. So I can say future or present. Okay? And so that's basically a very simple rule that I'm adding on. So I'm just putting some conditions on the mapping as well. So this is how I look at the persistence. So let's see if this starts now again. So I'm going to say restart the booking application. So I made all the classes as entity classes. Let's see if that helps into my JPA configuration. So if I don't have any errors, it basically means that the persistence layer is okay. It's not okay. So this time it's trying to tell me something. Could not resolve the property fuzzility. Okay, so it says fuzzility repository uses fuzzility, okay? And fuzzility is not an entity. It's not true, right? It's an entity. Yeah. So there's a query exception. Let me see. Created with the fuzzility repo. Okay, declared. Okay. It's fine. Invocation method fail. There's a query problem. List of find facilities by name. Reason? Okay. So what did I call the field? I call the field as facility name. Okay. And what did I put in my query? Let's check. Okay. So I call this as this is where it is wrong. Okay. So there's nothing like name. It's called as, you see, you call this facility name, right? So you should name the same thing, facility name, and that's exactly the variable that you want here as well. Okay. So you can normally have your argument as name, but this one should be exactly as how it is defined in your actual object. Okay. So that was the trouble. Okay. So let's try restarting it. So you can see that it is very, very case sensitive. If you had any specific names, you got to be very clear about how you call it again. So looks like, yeah, it's fine. It has started everything. So this is good news. Okay. So I think if you have come so far, I basically think the level 1 of your data access layer is done. Okay. So in summary, what did we create? We created configuration file for H2 connection. We created domain classes called booking, facility, and member. We also used an enumerated class to remember the status of the booking. It can be booked or it can be cancelled. That's the two states. Then we created a repository class layer. So this is where we inherited JPA repository. And at times we even had some custom queries. So we wrote some query methods and we defined method signatures for it. And then we saw if it works well. So that basically completes the data layer. So the next step is to write testing classes to see if all these methods work as expected. So I think that's going to take a bit more time, and I will release that as the third set of videos. Okay. So to summarize, if you remember, we went into this Excel draw. Just give me a minute to load the Excel draw. So we looked into 3 simple entities. We looked into the screens, Wi-Fi screens and all that. And so basically it's trying to revisit the same things that we did in the first video. So what we are trying to do here is we went back to create some kind of entity classes. Okay. So when you look into the original plan of the system, you can see that we created 3 different entities: facility, member, and booking. Of course, we had a support enumerated class called booking status. So we created the domain model, and then we created the persistence layer for this model using JPA repository. So that is where we started looking into the JPA documentation. So when we look into the JPA documentation, we know that JPA queries are quite forward. So what we did is, when we defined repository interfaces, instead of using simple repository, CRUD repository, or pagination, we started using the JPA repository, which is sort of much more inclusive of both the CRUD as well as the paging. And the template class is usually the model class that we have created, and the second argument is usually the primary key that we have created. So in our case, when you look into the booking repository, the booking class was the entity, integer was the primary key. When you look at facility, facility was the entity and integer was the primary key. When you look at the member class, member was the entity and integer was the primary key. So remember, we wrote some additional queries to find records by arguments. So if you send the first name, you get list of members by that name. You can pass the last name, you can pass the username. Of course, obviously, if you are sending a precise first name or last name, you will only expect to see one record, provided your usernames are unique. Otherwise, you will find multiple records. So first name and last name can have duplication. Username is not supposed to have duplication. So those are the domain rules. The same way in the facility repository, when you pass in a facility name, you should be able to pick up the list of facilities which is closer to that name. We didn't write any queries into booking repository as yet. We will start doing it once we build the application. So these are essentially the things that we have covered in this particular demo. The application starts without any error. You don't have any compilation error. So these are the two things that you should look for when you can say that this stage is complete. So I will stop my server, and of course I'll push this particular source code into GitHub so that you can take a look at this. Thank you very much for watching. On the next set of video, we will look into writing test classes to test these repositories that we have coded.